So it's my pleasure to introduce Ken McMillan. Ken got his PhD from Carnegie Mellon, where, as I think everybody knows, he invented symbolic model checking. And then his career took him to various places, including Bell Labs and Cadence, where he worked on SMV, for instance. And he's now a member of the RISE team at Microsoft Research, where he continues work on verification, on interpolation generation, invariant generation, and techniques like that. So it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Now, can you hear me? You hear me in the speakers? Good. All right. Okay, so this talk is about how to get some human-machine interaction going in the generation of invariants and other sorts of automated proofs. And part of the motivation for that is large proof efforts about real-world systems like CompCert or the Cell4 microkernel or the Ironclad, Iron Fleet project at Microsoft, Verity at Washington, various work at Intel and AMD on hardware verification, where they're doing proofs about large complex systems, or large for the kinds of things people do proofs about, but you'll find in almost all cases there's very little proof automation being used in these efforts. That is, they're almost all relying on proof assistants such as the cock prover that require very detailed manual guidance of the proof, not just in generating inductive invariants, but also in proving inductiveness of the invariants. And there's very little use of model checking or abstract interpretation or any of the kinds of techniques that we like to work on. And I hypothesize the reason for this is that these more automated tools have two properties. They're too brittle and they're too opaque. So by the first, I mean that the tools fail unpredictably and completely to get an answer at all. And this is, you might say, unavoidable since these problems are ranging from intractable to undecidable. And secondly, when they do fail, diagnosing and correcting the failures is quite hard. In other words, the tools don't communicate effectively what state they're in when they have failed to get a proof or a counterexample. So it's very hard to know how to continue when the tool, as it will, eventually fails. So the question I want to ask in this talk is, can we make these tools fail visibly, in a sense that I'll describe a little more precisely later? In other words, if they fail to prove a property, can they tell us what they did actually manage to prove? And can the user in some way explain then to the tool what's going wrong and what might be needed to be able to continue with the proof effort? And as an inspiration for this, I'd like to use Foldit, which many of you may know of. It's a game that allows non-chemists to discover the structure of proteins. So in the old way of doing things, you would have to grow a crystal in the lab and shine X-rays through it and look at the diffraction patterns and try to infer the structure. But the new way is combining somewhat brittle optimization algorithms that try to minimize the energy of the protein conformation with human visual intuition in a very interesting way. And Foldit has this property that I talked about, which is that it fails visibly. So the state of the algorithms can be visualized using 3D graphics. The users can interact with the graphics to provide guidance to the algorithms to help them to escape from local minima. And then in this way, the algorithms and the users, in fact, a community of users, then can solve the structures collaboratively. And I'd like to just show you briefly what that looks like on the screen. So here we have a graphic which is representing, okay, obviously I have to change my display settings in some way for you to see this. Again. Duplicate, that's what I want. All right, let's try that. So what you see here is a graphical representation of a conformation of a protein molecule, where these long squiggly things are chains of amino acids, and you have side chains on the side and so forth. And what we're trying to do is to minimize the overall energy of this configuration. Now, the tool provides some automation for us in terms of, for example, stochastic optimization algorithms. And I can apply one of those by clicking on this button. It says wiggle, a sort of a fanciful name for some kind of stochastic optimization algorithm. And you can see what will happen is the protein will start to reconfigure itself into a lower energy configuration. And at some point, it's going to get stuck. It's going to get stuck in a local minimum here. So what the user is doing is rotating this thing around and looking for opportunities to do better. Okay, so we can examine the 3D graphics. And what I just did there was I drew a rubber band between these two parts of these chains, which is essentially changing the energy function and saying I want to have these things closer together. Okay, and the algorithm will continue to run with that new function, and my score will get better. Right. And now I'll put another rubber band in saying I want this part to be closer to that part. And it eventually lines up in a better configuration where you may be able to see some little lines here indicating that hydrogen bonds have formed here that have reduced the energy. So what this has allowed me to do is to get a better structure by interaction between the human being and the tool using a visual interface. And that's the sort of thing that I would like to occur in, say, doing proofs about parameterized protocols. Right? I'd like to get the same sort of effect. Okay, that is clearly not the idea. Presentation, both screens. Okay, beautiful. All right, so that's this idea of failing visibly. Notice that this wiggle algorithm failed in a way that I could see what it was doing wrong, and I could correct it. Okay, so we used our visual abilities to analyze a large amount of information in graphical form. I want you to imagine, by contrast, seeing a big column of numbers representing the same information. And then, using the visualization, we diagnosed the problem and provided some guidance to the algorithm. So the questions that I want to ask in this talk are, what would it mean, for example, for a model checker to fail visibly when it neither gives a counterexample or a proof? What is the algorithm's state at that point, and how could I visualize it? And finally, what sort of guidance could a human user, as a result, give to the model checker to allow it to make some progress? So as a concrete scenario, imagine that we're just generating an inductive invariant for some system by abstract interpretation. So we start out with an abstraction phi naught of the initial states for whatever abstract domain we happen to have picked. Let's say we apply tau sharp once, the best transformer, to get phi 1, which is an over-approximation of the states of the system after one step. And we do it again to get an over-approximation at 2 steps. And let's say at this point that the safety property that we're trying to prove is not true in phi 2. So we've lost too much information to prove it at that point. Well, what an automated refinement tool might do here is it might say, well, why did I get a failure here at state 2? I might take this safety condition and compute its weakest precondition and say, well, why is that false here? What's a state here that could have gotten me to a state here that made the property false? And by answering that question, I might be able to decide on an abstraction refinement by looking at that set of bad states. Now, the question for us then is, suppose we've got to this point, what we have here in phi 1 and not the weakest precondition of S is a very complex formula that we don't want to look at. Right? So how can we display it in a way that the user can understand this set of bad states and try to make some generalization about it for us that will help us to continue? So what I would say is we don't want to be looking at formulas, we want to be looking at the semantics of formulas, because formulas are fairly arbitrary. And the semantics of a formula is just a set of models. And these, in turn, are typically relational structures that we can readily visualize. For example, we can use the alloy tool to do that. And here's an example of a graph that alloy would produce for a model of a particular formula. Here we have some elements of the universe. There are boxes. The blue ones are directories, and the yellow ones are files. And we have some arrows here that represent a relation between those things, which is the parent relation in a directory system. So that's an example of a visualization, but the trouble is it only visualizes one model. And our formula has possibly an infinite set of models, and we want to somehow understand that set of models. So that means we're going to need a more abstract representation than this. So a lot of what I'm going to do here is inspired by TVLA. Yeah, exactly. And there will be some differences and similarities. So you notice Muli was on the co-author list. So the way I'm going to do that is using something that I'll call an abstraction that I'll call a concept graph. And I called it that because the nodes of the graph don't represent individuals in the universe, they represent concepts or predicates. So let's say, for example, I have these two models. These are simple first-order structures with unary predicates P, Q, and S that I've represented with the colors red, green, and blue. And I have one binary relation R that connects some of the elements. And I have two models that are similar but slightly different. And what I'd like is one abstract representation of that pair of models. So what I'll do is I'll use my predicates P, Q, and S as nodes in the graph. So this node represents everything in the models that satisfies predicate P, this one that satisfies predicate Q, and this one that satisfies predicate S. So a simple node, like this node marked S of X here, represents some possibly empty set of individuals that satisfy the predicate S. So you notice in this model there is no S, in this model there is, but this got combined together into that single node. Now, we have various little graphical doodads here that represent different information. So that node in the middle, as in a shape graph, is a summary node. And what it's saying is possibly there's more than one Q. And you can see that that's true in one of my two models. There's more than one Q, though not necessarily in all of them. Oh, the X is just a free parameter. It's just standing in for the parameter of the predicate. So that's how you would actually type it into the tool. Or you could have a predicate with two parameters, X and Y, or whatever. So, and here we have a definite node, which gives us a little more information. It has a bold outline, and it says there's exactly one of these in every model, which can be useful to know. And some of this information wouldn't occur in a shape graph, because a shape graph is really an abstraction of a single model. Right? So, as in shape graphs, we also have definite and indefinite edges. So there's an indefinite edge that says that some pairs from P of X and Q of X may be connected, though not necessarily all, which you can see is true in this pair of models. And this is a definite arc that says all the pairs, all the green-blue pairs are connected. In fact, there's only one green-blue pair, and here it is, it's connected. And of course, you can come up with other sorts of conventions too. You could say, you could have arcs, for example, that say that the relation is one-to-one between these concepts and so on. Okay, so each of these graphical elements is just representing a simple logical fact about that set of models. And the way I'm going to express those is with a little modal notation. I'll say box phi is true of the models of gamma if phi is true in all models. Okay? And correspondingly, diamond phi is true if phi is true in some model. Okay, and everything we saw there can be expressed in this way using these operators. And I'll just use the ordinary cardinality bars to talk about the cardinality of the predicate in a model. So if we look at these graphical notations now, my simple node said possibly the cardinality of P is greater than 0. Okay, somewhere in some model there exists a P. An invisible node, one that you don't see, would typically say necessarily the cardinality of P is 0. So P doesn't occur in any model. If I have a solid arc between, for a relation R, between two concepts, it's saying necessarily, if P of x holds and Q of y holds, then R of xy holds. R of xy holds between all such pairs. If I had a missing arc that you don't see, it might represent the fact that there are no such R arcs, just the negation of that fact. And we can go on making more interesting and detailed graphical notations to the extent they're useful. So here I had a summary node, which says possibly the cardinality is greater than 1. Somewhere you have 2 of these guys at least. Okay, or I could have, this is my regular indefinite node, my regular node. I have my empty node, and I have my definite node that says that the count of P, the cardinality of P is exactly equal to 1 in all models. And I could keep, making these up as I go along. Similarly for relations, I can have an arc that says all pairs are connected, an arc that says no pairs are connected, an arc that says neither one of those facts is true. So sometimes they're connected, sometimes they're not. I could have an arc that says that the function is one-to-one or injective, whatever it is that I want. Okay, so the idea now is that we're going to provide the user the ability to focus in on relevant information by choosing these graphical conventions. Yeah. Yeah, okay. What we do right now is we generally project that relation. We project out one component onto some particular element of the universe to avoid having as much clutter in the graph as a ternary relation would produce. But I'm not sure what the best solution is for that. The general idea is that you want to have the user be able to pick and choose how much information to present so that the graph doesn't become overwhelming. Yeah, well, there could be many things. In my particular example, that's what we're trying to visualize. We're trying to say where and why did the abstraction lose the information that caused the property not to be proved. But you could apply this general idea of a concept graph to a lot of things. Right. Well, this was a failed proof attempt, so I'm not sure what. Or you mean when you fail to, when let's say something was unsatisfiable and you failed to, when something was satisfiable and you failed to get a satisfying assignment, right? So typically what's going to happen there is you're going to be stuck in some way, right? And you need to look at the argument for why you're stuck, right? And you need to say, here's the new fact that I need to learn that's going to push me out of that stuck place towards the solution, just like in Fold It, where you said, I want to get out of the local minimum, right? So you can think of the proofs and the counterexamples are a little bit dual, right? And if you're searching for a counterexample, sometimes you need a good proof. Okay, so what I want to do is provide the user with ways of focusing in on relevant information. Going back to this question of what happens if there are too many arcs in the graph. So I don't want to see all possible predicates represented there. I want relevant ones that are going to help to explain to me what the prover didn't prove that needs to be proved. So I will let the user choose those concepts and relations to display. I will let the user refine this abstraction. And I will also let the user focus down on a narrower space of models, right, by doing something that I'll call materialization. And we'll see what that means in a minute. So by applying these operations interactively, again, I'm trying to expose the root cause of a proof failure. So for refinement, one thing that I can do is I can just take my existing concepts and split cases. So let's say that I had here a concept graph with just the predicate px and not p of x. All the nodes, everything satisfying p and everything not satisfying p. And you can see this is a fairly vague graph, right? It's giving us not a lot of information about these two models. If I was interested in that node that said not p of x in that summary node, I could try splitting cases. For example, splitting cases on the predicate q. And that would turn that node into two nodes here. In fact, only one of them would now turn into a summary node, the case representing q. And the case representing not Q would now be a singleton, and I would now have a definite arc here. So I've added more information to this graph by refining this abstraction, by making my concepts more refined. And we'll see a case of that in action in a minute. The other interesting thing to do is to materialize things. And that means saying, well, suppose I think that there exists a node here that's a successor of this definite node P. I'd like to see it, right? I'd like to give it a name and focus on it. And so the way I can do that is I can materialize, tell the tool, materialize this edge, make this into a definite edge by giving the thing at the end of this arrow a name. And that would give us a graph like this. It would say, well, here's the one unique node that's a successor of P. And you can see once we've broken it down there that this node also has one unique node that's its successor in both of these graphs. So we've brought out a lot of information about these graphs by this process of materialization. And what we'll use that for mainly is trying to build up small substructures that look like they might be the root causes of failures. So I'll start to try to explain that by looking at a very trivial protocol example. And this is a client-server protocol. We have a collection of clients and a collection of servers, which might be the same machines. You have an arbitrary number of them. And where each server has a semaphore, so that when you connect to it, you have to take the semaphore. So ideally, we should be able to prove that at most one client is connected to a server at any time. That's an invariant that we would like to prove about this protocol. And the protocol has two simple actions. The connect action is going to establish a connection arc between two nodes, and it will put the semaphore at the server end down. And the corresponding disconnect action will remove that arc, and it will put the semaphore up. So completely trivial protocol with a completely trivial invariant, but we're going to try to see how the invariant debugging process works here. So I'm going to essentially try to show that the property I want to prove is an inductive invariant. I'm going to do abstract interpretation, if you will, with just one predicate in my abstract domain that says that this says no two clients are connected to the same server. And this will turn out not to be inductive, but we want to find out why. So let's say we started with the exact initial states. We did one connection, and it turns out after one connection, this mutual exclusion property is true. So that's what we learned in our abstract domain. Then we do another connection, and we reach top. Okay, so we've lost all information at this point. We want to know why we lost the information. Well, the natural thing to do there is to pull this back one step and say, well, if we had a failure of mutual exclusion here, what were the states back here that could have gotten us here? Right, we're trying to pull it back to its root cause. Okay, so we'll take, again, the weakest precondition of the property, take its negation, and conjoin it with P1. So this is essentially, these are all the counterexamples to induction, if you want. Okay, so here's what the visualization will look like when you start. It starts with one summary node that represents the entire universe. What we're trying to visualize here is those set of bad states, the one that can get ones that are counterexamples to induction. And right now it's telling us no information. This S actually stands for the default sort, and so it tells you nothing. So what we'll do then to start seeing information in this graph is we could split cases. For example, we could split into the nodes where the semaphore is up and the nodes where the semaphore is down using this predicate S. If we did that, we'd get these two nodes. So we're saying this universe of bad states, the set of bad states, consists of some nodes where the semaphore is up and some where the semaphore is down, which is not very interesting. But one interesting fact we might notice is it contains a possible arrow to a node where the semaphore is up. And that seems to be wrong. Okay, when we connect, we're supposed to put the semaphore down. So we're going to guess that that is the problem and materialize that arc. So we pointed to that arc, we said materialize. Now the two ends of that arc have names, A and B. Right? So I'm saying the universe consists of one little substructure like this plus a bunch of other stuff. Right? And this is how I'm going to tell the tool what you need to check next. I'm going to say, I think that's bad. Try to prove that that particular situation doesn't happen. So I ask the tool to do that, with this command called reverse, and what it comes back and it says, I can't reverse this. There are no pre-states of this particular set of states. And in fact, I can generalize this and prove something that rules it out. And what it's saying it can prove here is that it's impossible that there's any V0 and V1 such that V0 and V1 are connected and the semaphore of V1 is up. So it just took my little example and generalized it with some universal quantifiers. Technically speaking, it computed an interpolant. Okay. And so the result was now, with that additional refinement, I can prove the property. My abstract domain now contains an inductive invariant that proves the property because I've taught the tool one additional useful fact. So the idea here, I mean, this was a trivial proof, so you know we haven't done anything interesting here, but we've used this concept graph idea to compare the bad states to our intuition about how the protocol is supposed to work. We've materialized a little bad substructure that we think ought to be ruled out. We've conjectured that that doesn't happen. Right? We gave that to the system, and in ruling that out, the system then gave us another generalization, an interpolant that we used as an abstraction refinement. So we sort of put the human being in the abstraction refinement loop. Okay, so I told you about that to tell you about this, which is a more interesting protocol verification example, and a case where you can see that the visualization is actually starting to help us to get some intuition. And this is to do with the Chord ring maintenance protocol. Now, Chord is a distributed hash table protocol, and I'm not going to actually talk about the hash table. I'm just going to talk about the ring maintenance part of the protocol. Okay, so in Chord, we have a collection of hosts, which I will call nodes, and each host has a unique ID in some finite range, 0 to n minus 1. And the hosts need to know about each other. They need to know how to contact each other. And so they maintain a set of successor pointers that are going around the ring modulo 0 to n minus 1. That is, ideally, number 3 is going to point to number 6 here because 6 has the least distance from 3 modulo n. Okay, so this would be the ideal configuration of the ring. And of course, things go wrong, and we need to be able to somehow adjust. So to handle the fact that some of these nodes might fail, the protocol has additional successor arcs. So 3 points to 6, which is its best successor, but it also points to 7, so that just in case 6 were to fail, the ring wouldn't become disconnected. Right? So I want to be able to repair the ring when someone drops out. And to do that, it's also necessary for 3 to keep a predecessor arc and to remember that 1 is its predecessor. Okay? So this is the data structure that we're looking at. These are the basic relations: first successor, second successor, predecessor. Now, what the protocol wants to do is self-stabilize in case of failures, and here's what that looks like. So here, I have solid arcs representing the ring. This double dashed arc is representing the second successor of 5, which is 24. And this arc is representing the predecessor of 24, which is 17. I've left out a few arcs for clarity. Now suppose node 11 there were to fail. And nodes fail by just stopping. So what would happen is 5 would ping 11 periodically, and when it didn't get back an answer, it would assume that 11 had failed. And it would remove its arc to 11, and its second successor, 24, becomes its first successor. So you can see now we don't have a ring anymore because 17 is hanging off on what's called an appendage. We need to somehow bring 17 back into the ring. So what will happen then is a stabilize operation where 5 says to 24, who's your predecessor? 24 says it's 17, and 5 says, oh, that's a good successor for me. That's better than 24. So I'll put in a new successor arc. And you can see we're rebuilding the ring here. And then, okay, what you can't see off the side of the screen here is that 5 has then notified 17 that it's the new predecessor of 17. So 17 got a predecessor arc going this way. So at that point, the ring is now, the ring state is now reconstructed. Okay, so that sounds really simple, and it is. But as it turns out, the correctness of this protocol is quite subtle. And Pamela Zave spent a lot of time on this protocol, and she found that there's some matter of controversy about its correctness, and that all of the invariants of the protocols that were claimed in the papers weren't really invariants, and it wasn't really clear what the specification of the thing should be, and so on. So she came up with this. Said, well, we can make some assumptions under which some version of the protocol is correct. And one of the assumptions was that there had to be at least one node, I'm actually simplifying her argument, had to be at least one node that was stable in the sense that it never failed. If there was one node in the ring that never failed, we should be able to show that the ring always stays connected and never breaks apart because of failing nodes. We also had to make an assumption that all of the successors of one node cannot fail before the node picks up another successor. Otherwise, the ring would clearly be broken. But that's a reasonable assumption, since I should have many successors. And so given those assumptions, she could then prove for up to 8 nodes, using alloy, that every node can reach this origin node via best successor arcs. And a best successor arc is basically, out of all my successors, the nearest one that hasn't failed yet, that's still active. Okay, so the best successors all sort of eventually point to this origin node, the one that never fails. And that was the essence of her proof. So we could show then that there's always exactly one cycle, and everyone can always reach the cycle by its best successor nodes. Okay, so now we're going to try to automate that proof. We're going to try to use some abstract interpretation. And the main idea of the proof, the part of this that's going to be manual, okay, is that we're going to order all the nodes by their distance to the origin, their distance to that one node that definitely doesn't fail. And we expect that all the best successor arcs are going to be downward in that order, right, so that we can then show that everyone eventually reaches Q. Okay, so here's the down relation, slightly cut off. Here's Q at the bottom of it, whatever number that happens to be. Okay, and let's suppose we have some nodes that don't have any successor arcs that reach this node. Well, because this set is well founded under the down relation, we know that the set of error states is going to have a least element. Right? We're applying induction here, and we're going to prove that the least element of the error set, that there is a least element of the error set that I will call LE error, in case the error set is non-empty. So this is the manual part of the proof. This is instantiating an induction schema. And now for the automated part of the proof, what I want to do is I want to use abstract interpretation to generate an invariant now, proving that the error set is always empty. Okay? So what I did was I said, well, I made a bunch of template formulas. These are universally quantified formulas in first order logic that made up my abstract domain, and I tried to do abstract interpretation to prove this, and of course I failed, because I want to show you what happened when I failed. So now I may have to do some more tricks to get that piece of the demonstration on the screen. Plays. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to show you how that goes. So we're going to start here. I think it's, okay, we're starting here. No. I'm still having trouble getting this on the display. I think I need to make PowerPoint go away. That's my dog, by the way, in case you didn't infer that. Yeah, her ball. She's a soccer fan. All right, so let me see if I'm still in the plays mode. I am. Maybe I should just start again. Windows P, you think so? Okay, that didn't work. Duplicate, okay. Yeah, I don't know why that didn't work in the... Windows is eternally a mystery. All right, so let me try to show roughly what that looks like. What we're seeing here is an abstract counterexample. Okay, so what happened was we did some abstract interpretation, and we did a bunch of operations. So we started from the initial state. Someone arbitrarily tried to join the ring, which creates an appendage. Then they notified their successor that I'm your new predecessor. A stabilize operation pulled them into the ring. Then there was another notify so that the new node gets its predecessor. And then an inherit operation was performed. And what that does is somebody gets a second successor. In other words, the successor of my first successor becomes my second successor. And then at that point, we performed a fail action, which means that somebody dropped out. And now the error can occur. This is just a transition that says that if the error set is not empty, we go to a special error state. And that's the thing that we're going to try to rule out. Okay, so what we'll do to try to rule that out, go and we'll click on that state. Obviously I have to. Really? That's wants to really keep me informed. All right, so again, here's our universe of bad states. And I'm going to go back and compute the weakest precondition of that error state. Okay, so if I do that, I'm going to say reverse, which does that. And here I have that weakest precondition. But again, I'm not looking at any information. That's just the whole set of states. So what I want to do now is say, well, remember I said my induction principle said that there was a least element called LE of error, the least guy that didn't reach the origin, the closest to the origin that didn't get there. And I just materialized him. Right? I said, I want you to name him in the graph, so I have that one bad guy and everybody else. Not any very interesting information yet, but now I'm going to say, okay, well, if that guy's bad, then obviously he doesn't reach the origin through his successor, so why not? So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to materialize his successor. I'm going to look at the S1 relation, which is the first successor. I'm going to say materialize an arc into the void here. Okay, I choose the relation S1. Okay. And now I have a definite node there who's the first successor of the bad guy. All right? And I want to say, well, why doesn't the successor save him? And as it turns out, the reason is his best successor in all the bad states is inactive, has failed. So there's no path to the origin through him. So the only other possibility is that there's a path through to the origin through the second successor. So I would go ahead and materialize a second successor in the same way that I just did the first successor. I pick the second successor relation, and I say, get me the guy that he points to. Give that guy a name. And thinks about it for a second or two, and leaves us here. So here you see that the guy who putatively fails the property has this blue arc to the second successor, and that second successor is active. Right? So that still seems okay to me. Right? I would think that if my second successor was active, then the second successor ought to reach the origin, but somehow doesn't. Right? And the only reason that I can think of why he wouldn't reach it is because he must not satisfy the inductive hypothesis. It must be that he, yeah.
So what is A?
A means, A is a predicate that means active.
Can I think of it as a machine in the ring?
Yeah, a machine in the ring that has not failed. Exactly. So what you're seeing is three machines in the ring. One of them, our analysis says doesn't reach the origin. He's the least guy that doesn't reach the origin. He has a first successor who's dead. Right? He has a second successor who's still alive. Okay, and so by inductive hypothesis, if this guy were lower in the order, he would have to reach the origin. So the next thing I'm going to do is actually display that ordering relation. which is called down, because I want to understand why this guy is bad. There we go. So I'm going to get the down relation. I actually tell the tool the down relation is a partial order to help it display it. And what happens then is start to see something is wrong here, because these purple arcs are the down relation. They're saying getting closer to the origin. And you can see that his first successor is down but dead, and his second successor is up, necessarily up in all the bad models. And that's what I think is wrong. Remember I said I wanted all of those best successor arcs to head toward the origin, and in this case, for some reason, it hasn't, right? So in my abstract state, according to what I've proved, it's possible for those arcs to go up. So what's nice about this is you begin to be able to use the graphics to get some intuition about what's going on, because I can use this vertical dimension to represent this well-founded order over which I'm trying to do induction. And I can see visually that the arc is going in the wrong direction. So what I'll then do is I'll tell the tool, this situation looks bad. Take all of these definite arcs and nodes that you see here and turn them into a set of constraints and try to prove that that set of constraints can never be satisfied. Try to prove that this little substructure that you see is actually infeasible, cannot be reached. So I do that by using this option of the tool called gather. Okay, it gets me this set of logical constraints, and I say, okay, go try to prove that that can't really happen. So again, we're going to do reverse. And what happened here was now, we were here after a fail operation. Now we're computing the precondition here before the fail operation. And you can see that what's different is our bad guy's first successor actually was active in that state. So in other words, the fail operation took this guy from active to inactive. And if we go back and forth using undo and redo here, see that after the fail, that guy has not A, and before the fail, has A. So this is clearly the source of the problem is that this guy's successor failed, right? And he somehow lost his only path to the origin. Okay. So, you know, something is still going wrong here. But it's not completely obvious why that state should be unreachable. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to say, well, I have to somehow prevent this guy from failing, because if he fails, then this guy is dead. He can't reach the origin anymore. And the only reason I know why a node wouldn't fail is because that node actually is the origin, which is the stable node that can't fail. So I'm going to display over here a little more information. I'm going to look at each of these nodes and whether they're possibly equal to Q or not, the origin. And what it says is all of these guys are not the origin in all the bad states. Right? And that's my clue, right? This is my thing where I say, okay, I might be able to prove that this situation doesn't happen.
Next one, not doing the analysis. Because not doing the analysis, look at abstract state and then change it a bit and then continue forward.
Right, so this is actually, we're looking at an abstract state here that's actually not the fixed point. In fact, it's the abstract state that you get by abstractly executing just this sequence of operations. So I'm trying to create a refinement that will just rule out that particular bad sequence of operations. And I'm doing it by sort of moving backwards and saying, what was the root cause of the failure here? Okay, what would cause that back here? What would cause that back here? And eventually I'll get to a contradiction. And I'll say, well, that thing just can't happen here in this abstract state. And that's going to give me a clue as to refinement. That's going to say I found the root cause of the problem, or a possible root cause. So what I've said here is, I think this now looks like, this little graphic looks like the root cause of the problem. Right? That is, somehow this particular case where this guy has not failed and is not the origin, and the other pointer is up there, that shouldn't occur. And I'm not sure it shouldn't occur, but I'm just going to ask the tool as a conjecture to try and prove that this doesn't happen. So I do what we did before. Okay, I say, get a set of constraints corresponding to that little substructure and try to reverse it. And at this point, it did what you saw before in the client-server example. It said, I can't actually go back one state, right? There's no predecessor state there's no way to get from here to here. okay, over this. This actually was a notify operation. And it generalized this condition, and it said, here's a universally quantified condition, okay, but here's a case that I can rule out. And I'm saying for any V1, V0, V1, V2, it's not the case that the first successor of V1 of V0 is V1, and the second successor is V2, and neither of these guys is equal to the origin, and it's down from V2 to V1. This was this case where the second successor pointer is going the wrong direction. So it said, this is a general thing that I can prove that will rule out your particular case there, and maybe other things. And I said, okay, I like that as a refinement, so go ahead now and try to do the proof. So at that point, the tool with this additional refinement is then able to, I have to start PowerPoint again, unfortunately. Okay. Okay, so with that refinement, it's then, the tool is able to not only then prove that that trace doesn't produce the error, but in fact, it comes to a fixed point, which proves that the error set is always empty. Right? And in fact, that little refinement that we got corresponds to a key part of the invariant in Pamela Zay's manual proof. Right? And it was the thing that said that you never have the case where the successor list skips over the stable node, so that my first successor doesn't take me to the stable node, and the second successor skips over. Right? So we actually were able to infer this important part of the invariant by just analyzing these graphs rather than reasoning from concrete counterexamples, let's say. So what that actually gives is then the first parameterized proof of that protocol, right? Because here we actually have an inductive invariant that's expressible in a decidable logic that we can use to prove this, whereas Pamela's proof used transitive closure, for example, and didn't live in a decidable logic. So it shows that visualization tools can be used to diagnose failures in fairly subtle proofs. Okay, so just to give a comparison, for this little visualization that we produced, here was the corresponding formula. This was the set of bad states expressed as a formula inside the tool. And you can imagine that it would take a long time staring at that to figure out what was going wrong, whereas here we have a very nice graphical demonstration of the source of the problem. Okay, so by visualizing the semantics of formulas then, we have allowed abstract interpretation to fail visibly. That is, when we didn't get a fixed point that proved the property, we could see what was going on, and we could try to diagnose where the information was lost in the process and fix the problem. And this idea of using abstract representations of semantics is necessary because the algorithm state is essentially represented by a set of formulas, and we need to be able to visualize all of the models of that set of formulas, that is to say, all of the bad states, and not to try to generalize from a single bad state. So we also saw that a simple graphic can capture in a clear way the relevant content of a very complex formula, which we saw in the previous slide. And we also saw that in order to get that simple graphic, we needed some user interaction and intuition, right? I had to make decisions about what information to display based on my knowledge of the protocol. So I'll leave that comment aside. So to conclude, I would say this. If you are developing any kind of verification algorithms, be they abstract interpretation or model checking or theorem proving, you might want to consider some questions. How well would the technique that you're developing integrate into a large and complex, at least partly manual proof effort, like, for example, CompCert or Verity or whatever? And to do that, if you did that, would the algorithm fail visibly? In other words, if the user were trying to construct a larger proof and the algorithm didn't get an answer, positively or negatively, how hard would it be for the user to actually figure out why the tool failed? Right? Does it fail visibly? Okay, and as a result, would a user building a larger proof actually consider this piece of automation to be more effective than a fully manual but more predictable approach, which is what thus far people have tended to choose? Right? And I think it's important for us to think about those kinds of questions. And in order to get there, what I'm suggesting is that we maybe ought to think about putting the human in the loop of these algorithms. Right? In other words, using something like interactive visualization in the style of Foldit to allow users to collaborate with the algorithm and not just wait for the answer of the algorithm. Allow users to do things like diagnose where information was lost and suggest relevant generalizations. And so perhaps in this way, we can then convince people who are doing large-scale, mostly manual proofs to actually use some more proof automation. Very much. Okay, so I have not, for ternary relations, as I said, the only thing we've done so far is to allow the user to say, pick one of the three components and say, make that food, and then look at all of the just quadratically many arcs that you get from that. Now, whether you could actually say, use some clever visualization tricks to actually see the quadratically many arcs in a ternary relation, we haven't tried it yet. That's an interesting question. I mean, I don't think we've gotten very far in terms of visualization techniques. What you saw was extremely primitive.
Just a quick comment, I want to let them know.
In synthesis tools these days, like synthesis by example and other such things, this thing of failing visibly, it's like almost a requirement, because if you are synthesizing, program may not always be exactly what you want unless you can examine the result. Then this would not be useful. So all the PBE work, I mean, kind of has this component very central. It has to fail visibly.
Yeah.
So you just can examine the results.
Right. So when you get, say, a result from synthesis, so how do you actually then know that it's?
Yeah. So it's like if you are changing synthesizing Excel, any kind of transformations, users can usually very quickly spot if there is some change, there is an outlier in the data. And they can say, I don't want this one, refine the search. So synthesis tools cannot produce something that is complicated, like synthesize some complex algorithm where it's not 100% guaranteed to be correct and you cannot visualize it. Then it's actually worse than not having anything.
Yeah. So that's a good point. It's generally true about synthesis that you have this problem that you don't know if you underspecified any given synthesis tech, and so the question of how do you actually get back information so the user can evaluate, I think is interesting. Are there techniques that people use that are graphical for that?
Not much there, but I'd say most of the successful synthesis tool must have this. Like if you're synthesizing, for instance, data structures from shapes, you need to be able to visualize the result of this data structure and to see what shapes it produces. Otherwise, you're not sure if it's
able to understand the output. Yeah. Point.
Other questions?
So I was wondering what happens if my fixed point actually computation fails, so it doesn't terminate. Can this help you also in that case?
Yeah, so a typical reason why the fixed point computation wouldn't terminate is because it's failing to produce a good generalization. And so it might make a good generalization and just terminate, or it might make an infinite sequence of bad generalizations.
That's what I'm...
And so what you want to be able to do is to be able to catch it when it's doing that. So exactly what bound you want to put on, I don't know, but you could imagine different approaches. So you could imagine saying, I want you to, unroll this loop no more than 3 times, right? And if you haven't converged, I want you to show me what you have, and I'll try to produce a better generalization for you than the one that you've produced. So that would be one possibility. But generally, you'd have to pick some kind of stopping criterion, to say, I think it's diverging at this point, and that the tool needs some help. And that's a matter that we still need to understand better.
So was your approach effective also in these cases?
Well, yeah, I'm trying to think if we have a case where that was true, where essentially the algorithm, instead of failing, it just went off to infinity. So I don't think I have a case of that yet, but that's obviously going to happen, right? And you need some way for the user to say, at some point you're failing, so stop, and let me help you do better.
So personally, I like the interaction as you showed it, but philosophically, I guess it seems surprising that you visualize the potential counterexamples, but you don't visualize the refinements that you find. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, it would be like that formula that you saw could certainly be visualized. I could display that visually in fact, as just a little substructure that's ruled out. So I think you're right, I should do that.
You do the refinement sometime, that is the imprecision sometime is not explainable in the abstract itself. So you have to change the space and go more concrete. So you have a kind of predetermined hypothesis that the failure will be
right. So that's another good point. So the abstract domain that I'm using now is, or rather the one in which I'm doing refinements, is in this case it's alternation-free first-order logic, right? And the reason I want it to be alternation-free is for decidability reasons. Be able to actually know when I have a fixed point. And so, of course, sometimes that's not going to work. I'm going to need a for all exists statement in the logic. So, it's an open question. If you need that, I can show the user that, in fact, there is no universal statement, right, that will rule out this bad case, but I don't know how to tell the user to say, what is the witness that you need to produce for some AE formula, in order to carry on in the proof effort. So you're absolutely right. If we go outside of the framework and say there is no, say, universal inductive invariant, then right now the tool doesn't have much ability to tell you what's wrong. Well, it's difficult, but I think one of the things that that we're trying to see is how much of that do you really have to do in proofs about real systems. So in this case, in the case of Chord, we didn't need it at all. In the case of, say, the flash cache coherence protocol, you need to do it once. You need to introduce one witness, and it's a manual thing that you just have to do before doing the automated proof.
Okay, so you somehow explained how to do CGAR manually, but could you also help to diagnose when an automatic CGAR fails, right? When it continues to generate always the same counterexample.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a little bit what we were talking about before, right? So the idea is not really to do things the way that I just described, where I gave the abstract, it's not a wrong way to do it. I gave the abstract domain, it wasn't quite sufficient, and I refined it once. I did that same thing with the flash cache coherence protocol, and there were about 20 refinements I had to do, because my abstraction guess wasn't all, it's like an order of magnitude more complicated protocol. So what I would really like, and which we do have, although we don't have enough experimentation with it yet, is everything you saw me do manually can also be, and also is, automated. But it just may not do generalization as well as I could do it. So the idea is more to run the automated generalization up to the point where the generalizations get too complex according to some metric. And that was the thing I said I didn't know. What is that metric? Right? And then stop and say, I can't produce a good generalization. Can you help me? So hopefully, say, for the flash, that would get me to the point where 28 of those refinements were done automatically, and I just had to do 1 or 2 tricky ones. And that would be sort of the point we wanted to get to. But yes, the idea is to have more automation than what you saw.
Okay, thanks again for a very interesting talk.